Hello, friends, and welcome to Mousterpiece Melodies, a podcast that's listening to the songs of Disney movies, past and present. I'm Josh Spiegel.
And I'm Scott Renshaw. Thanks for joining us on this comprehensive and encyclopedic compendium of all things Disney music. Now playing Tarzan.
Before we get into our discussion, thank you for listening. No matter how you're checking us out, we hope you like what you're hearing, and if you are, we'd appreciate it if you could rate and review Mousterpiece Melodies on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever app you're using to listen.
That's right. Let everyone know how much you love the show and tell your friends to do the same. You can follow me on Blue Sky at Scott Renshaw and read my film criticism at cityweekly.net.
And you can follow me on Blue Sky at Mousterpiece and email me at mousterpiececinema@gmail.com with any comments, questions, or opinions you'd like to share. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get into our discussion of the songs of Tarzan. And to do that, we are thrilled to welcome into the show a very special guest. He is the editor-in-chief of Episodic Medium, a publication I've mentioned here, a handful of times. I forget why. Myles McNutt, welcome to Mousterpiece Melodies. Thanks for being here.
I am so thrilled to be here. I will say that I feel that I volunteered myself for this podcast is the best way to put it.
You did, because after our last discussion where we spoke with Monica Castillo about the songs of Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros, Scott and I were talking, and we were like, we don't have a guest yet for Tarzan. And Scott put something out there into the ether of Blue Sky, and Myles, you raised your hand, and as you're about to find out, that was a grievous mistake on your part. But anyway, okay, so kidding aside, let's get into our discussion of Tarzan and its many songs. Now, the way that I always like to start these specific discussions, as Scott knows by now, as I mentioned all the way back when we started this show, I began this show after listening back to old episodes of one of my favorite podcasts, You Talkin, You Two to Me, which I'm going to be referencing a lot on today's discussion. I'm just going to warn everybody out there that I'm going to alienate every single one of you with references to that show, because anyone who knows You Talkin, You Two to Me knows they love their sub-podcasts, and one of them is Good Drummers. This is going to have to be an episode of Good Drummers, considering who wrote the songs of this movie. But the question I like to kick off with is a less ironic version of something they would ask on that show, which was, when did you first hear of the band U2? I know all three of us were alive and kicking when Tarzan came into theaters in the summer of 1999. So Myles first, then Scott, then I'll answer it. Do you have any recollection of your initial awareness of the Disney adaptation of Tarzan? Do you remember seeing it in theaters in the summer of 99?
Well, I definitely saw it in theaters. Let's be very clear on that point. Because I was seeing everything. I think one of the reasons why I think this is such an interesting period of time, for multiple reasons, sort of like as we're reaching that like liminal stage between the Renaissance and the 2000s, and just sort of understanding like what Disney was doing, I had reached the age where I was like paying attention to Disney films as sort of like a like meaningful build up, release, excitement, development, and kind of really anticipating them in more of that lens. And it's almost like I was going to grow up to be a media scholar because I was taking it so seriously. It's almost something that never happened. But like one of the things I think is so interesting is like I was still 13 years old. So I was still in a fandom phase. Like I still had a Turk stuffed animal. Like I was still in a vein of where that was sort of coming from. But I was also like seeing the films as sort of this like stretch of development. And I still had opinions at the Oscars the following year about the song that Phil Collins beat. And so as a result of that, like I feel like there's this sort of like, it is that transitional phase where I have nostalgia for it, but I was already starting to sort of perceive it in terms of its differentiation from and deviation from that Disney norm, which would, of course, become the dominant narrative of the early 2000s. And then it became more cynical, and then we kind of enter into more of the analytical phase. So it's kind of a bridge text for me.
Fair enough.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. Those who may have followed me or this show for a long time, I've been with Salt Lake City Weekly for 25 years now, but I started with a sister publication that they had at the time, which was based in Park City, Utah, called the Mountain Times, and I joined that paper in May of '99. So this was sort of one of my very early, I'm a professional critic kinds of things. That was really early in that process. So I was, feeling my oats a little bit. And I don't know that I had any, I mean, obviously, as Myles noted, this is coming at, the kind of the tail end of a period where every, subsequent Disney entry had a certain, cachet to it. We were tailing off a little bit because obviously in terms of box office, Lion King kind of became the peak, and then it was a little bit of a gradual decline from there in terms of the just sort of mass popularity of them. But it was still, it was still a big deal. Disney's, one release a year was still a big deal. And so you go in with a certain, this is one of those event movies of the summer. And as a child of the 80s and growing up with Phil Collins, I had certain concerns. And I think those were met to a certain degree. But I just remember what I liked about it was there were some really dynamic visual components to it. I really enjoyed that part of it. But musically, as we will get into it, that wasn't where I thought it was at its peak.
So, I mean, I have such a distinctive memory of the experience of preparing to see Tarzan, we'll say, that I don't know if I ever shared it on the old podcast. I'm pretty sure, Scott, that your time as my co-host on the old podcast came after I discussed Tarzan. I don't believe we ever did revisit it. I was going to say, we never did revisit the title. So
that's correct.
It is technically possible that I shared this before, but I really don't think I did because, as the two of you are about to find out, it's an embarrassing story. So when this movie came out in June of 1999, this episode's going up on the 16th of June of 25. This is merely days before the 26th anniversary of this film's release. I was 14, going on 15. I had finished my freshman year of high school. I was no longer a little boy who wanted to be a big boy, but I also wasn't really a big boy in that parlance. I was a dumb, nerdy, hopelessly, foolishly lovelorn kid. That's the thing, and that's where this story has to start because I had a huge crush on a very nice, very sweet girl in my grade in ninth grade who was so nice and so sweet that she was not willing to look me in the eye and tell me it's never going to happen until it was far too late. And that happened after the story I'm going to relay here. So I had asked her to go out a couple of times and she had said yes, which made me happy. But when other people would come with her, part of me was like, hey, that's not normal for dates. But the rest of me did not want to acknowledge what that must have really meant. I was very much in the, Jim Carrey and Dumb and Dumber, so you're telling me there's a chance phase. That's where my mind was. So when I asked her to see Tarzan, she said, sure. And I thought, yes, I'm in. And then she said, oh, by the way, some of my family is visiting from out of town. They'd like to see it too. Can they come? And of course, there was a part of me that was like, that's not what a date should be. And the other half of me was like, if you say no, you're going to lose so many points. You got to say yes, bro. And I don't know how I married anyone talking that way. But my point is, I said, sure, of course. Now, it's been almost 26 years. I do not recall with 100% certainty how many seats I was tasked with saving on opening night in the summer for a big new movie. I am 99% sure it was at least 5 seats. And I think we can all agree that's too many seats for anybody to have to hold. And especially when you are, I'm not going to make anybody's ears bleed with my impression of the pimply-faced kid from The Simpsons, but that's what my voice sounded like at age 14. So every time a grown-up would say, I would like to sit in some of these seats in the dead center of the stadium seating theater we're in right now to see this big movie with my family, I would say, I'm sorry, I'm holding these seats for people. So I'm telling you this because it is very obvious, and I can't deny it, that before the movie even began, my mind was not really in a very open space for Tarzan. And obviously that's not this movie's fault. That's not this movie's problem. But that's always kind of been in the very, very back recesses of my mind. I dredged it up for this discussion. And yet, as we're all talking about here, this movie comes at the tail end of the Disney Renaissance. I have already gone on record in previous publications. I do not believe this is the end of the Disney Renaissance. My argument is that Fantasia 2000, which was released 6 months later in IMAX theaters, that's the end of the Disney Renaissance period, in my opinion, for reasons that are separate. We don't need to get into those. But this is certainly at the tail end. So when I watched it as a teenager, and I watched it a couple of other times, obviously, even before I did the old podcast on this movie, I always thought that this movie was aggressively okay. And that the same was true for the songs. I would argue, I rewatched the film in advance of this discussion, and my reaction every time is akin to what my brother-in-law, who doesn't see a lot of new movies, but what he usually will say is if he sees a newer movie, he'll say, oh yeah, I saw new movie X. It reminded me of old movie Y, and the old movie was better. He'll just think about other movies that might feel that have inspired a new film. And it's really hard for me to watch Tarzan and not think of all the movies, specifically in the previous decade, from Walt Disney Animation Studios, that this film feels very reminiscent of. And I think the same is true of the songs, which, as already noted, written and mostly, not entirely, performed by Phil Collins of Genesis, of plenty of solo hits. And it is at this point that I should clarify something. I like Phil Collins' music. There's a part of me that wants to make a very glib joke about, like, I'm a straight white guy. Of course I like Phil Collins' music. That feels like that's kind of a requirement. But also, that's pretty unfair. The point being, I like Phil Collins' music. I very recently was re-listening to the final Genesis studio album, We Can't Dance. I know most people like to think that Phil Collins becoming the lead singer of Genesis makes that band a little different, a little less enjoyable. I disagree. I like that album a lot. I like a lot of Phil Collins' solo music. I should have been an ideal audience for these songs of this movie, both as a teenager and in the 26 years afterwards. Every time I watch it, and every time I hear people online either talking about how incredible these songs are, or how these songs are bangers, they slap, they insert whatever newer slang is appropriate here, I feel like Michael Bluth hearing his son talk about his girlfriend.
Her?
Really? These songs really? So, for example, thinking about things that have stuck in my craw for years to an unhealthy extent. This I might have mentioned, Scott, on the old show when we talked about the remake of The Lion King, because when that film opened, a lot of different websites wrote about that film or about the Disney Renaissance, animation in general, understandably so. One such website was The Ringer. I have no interest in being a gentleman. I'll name names. It was The Ringer, and they did a ranking of the 40 best Disney songs. Number 1, A Whole New World from Aladdin. Number 2, Circle of Life from The Lion King. Number 3, You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan. Now, while I let you all sit with that knowledge in the back of your heads, I will acknowledge I've written lists like this before. The premise of writing rankings like this on pop culture websites is to inspire debate and disagreement. If everybody reads that list and says, yes, I agree with this, that's a bad list. The flip side is I am here. I will be the arbiter. I choose to make myself the arbiter. If you think You'll Be in My Heart is the third best Disney song, you are the embodiment of that tweet about the guy who's only seen one movie, and that movie was The Boss Baby, watching a second movie saying, this has Boss Baby vibes. If you think You'll Be in My Heart is the third best Disney song, I assume you've only heard 3 Disney songs. Because give me a break. But I think that that's a great, like a microcosm of this film's songs has very ardent fans. I want to be very clear about that. I do not get why. I have heard these songs many times. They're fine. Leave aside the Oscar piece of it. Scott and I recently talked about the songs of Toy Story, so people who listen to that episode, you're going to hear us talk about it from the other side of it later. I don't get what it is about these songs. We'll talk about them one by one, of course, but even as a whole, they're fine. Here, maybe one of the two of you can tell me. What am I missing about these songs?
So part of why, in volunteering for this discussion, I knew your distaste for this. And in many ways, what you're saying is not that you hate these songs, but rather that you resent the way the internet has valorized these songs, which I totally respect. I resent most things that exist on the internet in many forms. The thing about this though, is that you're going to get into the version of it that I've seen the most of, right? And I think it's a part of this goes through this idea that Phil Collins didn't have to go so hard. right? That is the dominant meme structure that I have seen. This notion being that he was tasked with making songs for this animated movie, and the idea was that he created something that somehow transcended that. And I've always found that framing confusing, because I'm like, well, what do you mean transcended it? They're just songs. Like, when you look back through and figure that out, I think what's interesting about it to me is this idea of, okay, why in particular did this play out? Is it just that this isn't a traditional musical and therefore stands out? Is it just that the average age of online commenter just like verges so comfortably into this range where they were 5 when this movie came out instead of 15? And that changes their perspective in terms of the amount at which they wore out the VHS. This was probably released, this is still released on VHS in 1999, certainly.
Yeah.
I feel there was a clamshell involved. So the idea, like, is it just that it hit that exact moment of like online internet commenter in a way that it just doesn't resonate the same for us? And I mean, that's what's hard. And like, so I went back and like, I watched it, I listened to it, and then go through it. And it's like, look, I could sing most of these songs from heart. I know them really well. I have revisited this soundtrack. I have a decent amount of affection for these songs, but like, I'm not going to defend the discourse. I think that's where it's kind of like the line I'll draw, where it's just like, look, I understand, I appreciate the kind of structure around them, but the idea that something transcendent is happening here is still a hard sell for me, given where I think this fits into, like you said, this is in some ways the end of the Renaissance, and that's true, but it's also clearly demonstrating Disney's sort of resistance to the Renaissance and the concerns that stem from the box office failure of Hercules, in which they're kind of, I think, starting to run away from elements of what we thought the Disney Renaissance period was, out of concern for it being unable to replicate that success story. And again, I'm doing all the scholar stuff with this. I understand that, but like, I do think that helps frame for me, like, what is it exactly that is connecting people with these songs beyond just like, oh, I enjoyed that, or they exist from there. And I think that I don't have an answer. I really don't. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes.
This is, I mean, I come at this from a very different perspective as the elder statesman here, and as someone who grew up in the 80s listening to Genesis and Phil Collins on the radio in the, I mean, I remember listening to American Top 40 in the late 70s, and Genesis Misunderstanding was, like, wow, this is interesting. But the idea of wow, Phil Collins didn't have to go so hard. This is what I wonder, like, did you grow up listening to Phil Collins? Phil Collins always the bombast was kind of, even in the ballads that Phil Collins wrote, bombast was sort of his, that was his playground. That was his sandbox. So the idea that this was somehow, antithetical to who he was as a songwriter, it's like, nah. No, this is that guy, and it's but as a vocalist too, he's theatrical. I mean, anyone who has listened enough to know that this is, I could see it. At the same time, my issue with these songs is not necessarily even that I dislike them. It's, I really think they just all sound the same, and they all sound the same in the way that I remember. Those of you, again, who may have been old enough to be at that time, remember that there was a period where in the late 80s, early 90s, where it seemed like Jeff Lynne of ELO was producing everybody else, and everything sounded like an ELO record because Jeff Lynne was producing it. And then there was a period of time where suddenly Phil Collins was like, oh, he's going to do, a couple of other, and everything that he, produced sounded like it. And so these just all sound like, oh, it's what happened when Phil Collins' production gets on a song. They all start to sound the same, and that leads to something which just to me is not as musically interesting, because they all sound like the version of Phil Collins songs where he's getting very shouty.
Well, and I mean, I would also say, so I cannot claim to have maybe the same depth of awareness of, the real prog rock era of Genesis. But certainly when I was a kid, I mean, if my parents were here for some inexplicable reason in this podcast, they would be able to say, oh yeah, when Two Hearts came on, the song from the 1988 film Buster, that Phil Collins co-starred in with Julie Walters, that's a fact I just knew. Didn't even have to look it up. I don't know why or what's wrong with my brain that I knew that, but I did. Two Hearts was one of my favorite songs growing up. Sussudio, oh yes, I loved Sussudio as a kid. And I guess, leaving aside my taste in music at that time, the point, I guess, to add to what Scott just said is, since I had heard a lot of Phil Collins solo music, when I hear Tarzan, it's like, yeah, I mean, that sounds like Phil Collins stuff, but also I like those other songs better than these ones. And I mean, I would also say, like, I have a general hot take here that I think ties in a little bit to how the songs were decided upon in terms of how they're utilized. My hot take is connected to the fact that one of the film's directors, Kevin Lima, who went on to direct Enchanted in 2007, had said he did not want the character of Tarzan to sing on screen. You know, this is an adaptation of the classic Edgar Rice Burroughs character. Doesn't really make sense. And he's right. It really would not have made sense for Tarzan to burst into song. I know there's a Broadway musical version of this movie. I'm sure it's very weird. Full transparency, I've never seen it, but I kind of think it would be difficult for us to buy Tarzan bursting into a Broadway-style song. And I would go further than Kevin Lima. This movie shouldn't have songs. I think that it's a weird fit. I think the fact that Disney, in one case, but well before they started making fully computer-animated films, I don't know why I hadn't thought about it before. They took inspiration from how Randy Newman is utilized in the first Toy Story. We talked about that, as mentioned, with Tim Grierson, a film with songs that appear on the soundtrack. Obviously, the classic You've Got a Friend in Me, among others. Those are meant to function, kind of, sort of, as narration for us to get a better sense of what's going on in Woody's or Buzz's head. They're little plastic heads. And that's kind of what most of the songs here do. There's not all of them. There are 5 original songs, but a few of them are meant to be driving the narration, driving the plot. And I don't know that is I get why they did it, because if you're going to have songs in this movie, really would be weird for it to be Tarzan and Jane bursting into some romantic ballad or duet. But also, maybe that's a good sign that you don't need to have songs in an adaptation of Tarzan. I know that's probably too hot of a take for even some of our ardent listeners, but that's my thought, sincerely.
Well, so what I think is interesting here is, in thinking about this, I made the connection back to Toy Story, and I thought to myself, was that the point of inspiration, right?
Sure.
Were they specifically thinking, hey, that worked for Toy Story, that film was a huge success, and it was more successful than any of the Disney films that released after it? And I was just like, is that the point? But Tarzan shares a producer, Bonnie Arnold, came from the Toy Story films to work on this. And I do think that that's not a coincidence. And I found that detail in following the Wikipedia rabbit hole where Lima says that about Tarzan, where it's like, I can't imagine Tarzan, standing, on a tree just belting. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, I don't know why not exactly, frankly. I think you could. If you really
Quasimodo belted out a song. If you can have Quasimodo belt out a song, you can have frickin' Tarzan belt out a song.
It strikes me as a limit of imagination, and it seems very arbitrary, but it also says so much, I think, about that process. In that article, I think it's Chicago Tribune, or it was some sort of publication writing and talking to the production team. They mentioned Toy Story's success relative to the Disney films that came after. And they sort of make that connection of sort of looking at music differently and engaging with that. And I think it's one of those instances where I think if you start to look at the songs more as hey, this is basically original score. So many of them are montages, right? Realistically, same way the Toy Story uses Strange Things is the one that most resonates in that respect to me. But at the same time, it's also you do have Mark Mancino's score very much integrated and picking up on that. And so it does sort of take on this slightly different sort of tenor, even compared to something like Toy Story, in that, again, it's gesturing more at musical structure than Toy Story is, which doesn't feel like a musical, I would argue, by the same accord. But it also, again, it feels like a half measure. And once that clicks in, you start to think, okay, this is neither let's just make this a movie, and it's also not a musical. So why the in-between? Is it literally just the expectation? Is it literally just they want that Oscar nomination? What is it that is sort of driving this initiative?
I would say yes, this was the formula. This is the formula that they understood worked, that you have music in it. And, just referring back to Toy Story again, having 3 of those songs, just really 3 that were being sung by the same voice, was already starting to feel like it was pushing it. And that to me is part of this challenge of these songs is like, you can, I have no inherent problem with changing the idea of a musical to be less, you are watching the character singing. That's the way I would prefer it to be, but that's neither here nor there. The thing is, they all do start to sound, you have one voice, and that one voice I'd start to tune it out. And I think that is the problem I have, is that the half measure that they take might have worked with 3 songs. It doesn't really work with 6.
Mm. So these are all good points. So I do want us to dig into, let's do track by track. So for those listening to the show who haven't seen the film in a while, the movie kicks off with one of those songs, Two Worlds, the song that Phil Collins sings us as Tarzan's parents are escaping a burning ship, and it transitions into the baby who will be known as Tarzan. His parents die. Kala, the ape played by Glenn Close, loses her own child to it's a cheetah, I believe, an actual cheetah, not the little monkey from the old Johnny Weissmuller films. And as this is all happening and she finds the baby, I will note, by the way, she had to run a really far distance to hear the cries of the human baby. Yes. I hadn't thought about it before, but she does. And she finds him and she brings him into her clan, even though the male overseeing the group, Kerchak, voiced by Lance Henriksen, is not a fan of humans, generally speaking, for good reason. But she is able to convince him. So they sing. Phil Collins sings Two Worlds. And I think part of the problem I have with the song as it exists within the context of the story versus just listening to it as part of a soundtrack. There's a couple of bits here where, in a few of the songs that are montage heavy, where the lyrics are telling me something I could already kind of figure out. It's one of the oldest lines in the book, the oldest line in creative writing book, show, don't tell. We're getting shown enough, but then you have lyrics like, no words can heal a broken heart. And I think, well, duh, but thanks for trying, Phil. So I think that to me is the issue with a song like this. It's a fine song. I will say the only piece of it that I would challenge here, I know Scott, you used the word bombast to describe Phil Collins' musicianship, his singing style, whatever. I don't really know that when I hear Phil Collins' voice, I think, yes, just like Tarzan. And I guess, I think that's the one point of, where I can see the argument for have Tarzan sing the songs himself. I do think, by the way, the counter there, I know that the development process for these films takes a handful of years, but this movie did arrive in theaters just under 2 years after the wildly underrated George of the Jungle, which I know I talked about on the old show. I feel like that also may have been a challenge of doing a straight up musical of but some people might have just seen a much goofier spoof version of Tarzan, which, hot take, is better than this movie. So that's my thought on Two Worlds. What do the two of you think? I know, Myles, you were saying earlier, even with that song, you could sing along right to it. So even if it may not be, guy on the beach with the piano that's flaming meme of this is how hard he went, yada, yada. What are your thoughts on that song?
I mean, I think Two Worlds is the most awkward, and that's just because it's trying to tell a story, but like you say, it's kind of stuck. I actually would love to know how much of this was animated to the song versus the song. I know that I was reading the Wikipedia page through, and it suggested that, most of the songs he wrote based on the treatment of the story, right? Implying that he was just, inspired by the story and just kind of came up with this. But I listened to it, and it, you feel the montage. Some of these songs I listen to them, I don't see the montage in the same way. In this one, I start to be like, oh, right, the parents are dead now. I don't know if that's quite the vibe that's, associated with the banger in general terms. Just in general, I think that's kind of what stands out to me about this. I will say that it is sort of a case where, to the point of the narration, I understand that logic, but when I hear the idea of Randy Newman narrating Toy Story sounds right to me. The vibe of that film and Randy Newman's voice feel like there's a tonal fit in that process. Whereas Phil Collins narrating Tarzan doesn't make sense, right? It is neither jungle nor British enough to really feel like it's tapped in that time period. It just doesn't seem correct for that to be the voice that is associated with this. And so, again, it feels arbitrary. It's not to say I understand the logic, but when you say Phil Collins is the narrator of Tarzan, And it's like, no, he really isn't, right? Like the songs might be functioning that way on some level, but like to suggest that there is some sort of like actual like agency of Phil Collins over the story, is an absurd suggestion in the mistake.
Yes.
It's given what I've already said about my sense of the sameness, I think the fact that this song comes first goes a long way to explaining why I actually like it the best, is it hadn't worn out its welcome yet. And also, I think that it's just I really like the segment a lot. I just like the prologue and just the way that the structure of those montages. And I'm not listening to the lyrics. I'm watching, and I think it's got the right sound for just sort of the intensity of what's going on. So I think I'm much more forgiving, again, because I haven't started to get weary of Phil Collins' voice, and also because I just am enjoying watching it. And I think this is one of those that, for me, as we've talked in other episodes about the distinction between, is it a good song? Is it a good song in the context of the movie? To me, right in the context of the movie, it's working because it's giving me the vibe that I think that it wants that scene to create, in terms of there's something happening and this is what's setting up everything, and that drama is all there. So I think that it's working in context, and this is probably why I actually like it in this movie and not some of the examples of the let's say the cover versions that we might talk about later.
Well, and just kind of building on that, though, in that case, it's also like there are sections of this sequence that take Phil Collins out of the equation and leave the Mancina score in place, right? And so like the storytelling of the song kind of like merges with the music, and so you get the attack, the discovery, all those different intervals, all that gets to play out while the song is theoretically still building and growing. So in that way, I think it's probably, I would say, suggest it's the most successful musical moment in the film.
Yeah.
In terms of stitching these things together. I just think as a song, which is how I have experienced this for the most part for the past, 15, 20 years, since I don't really revisit the movie itself all that often. Right. I would say for that reason, it kind of like shifts in estimation from that perspective.
I mean, that's a fair distinction. It's difficult. You're watching, you're going, and song pauses here, and score, and score, and score, and song resumes here. And that's not the way anyone really experiences it. So I understand those listening to the soundtrack over the course of a generation are probably going to think of it in a different way than those who are thinking of it in the context of the full sequence in which it appears.
Yeah. Now, in case anybody out there is wondering, Josh, did any other songs from Tarzan get on that ringer list you referred to earlier? Two Worlds did. It's number 35 out of 40. My favorite line, I think it ties in here, the song's value isn't signifying that Phil Collins is about to get weird and successfully scored an entire movie. 1, he didn't get weird. 2, Mark Mancina wrote the score. Put some respect on his name. I read this and I think, how, like, to one of Myles' points earlier, it's like, how many of the people who wrote this list were 5 when this movie came out? Because a big chunk of the songs on the list are from the Disney Renaissance, and I'm not going to sit here and say that many of the great Disney songs aren't from the Renaissance, but, for example, a song that I can't help thinking was missing on this list is Baby Mine from Dumbo, because it really is missing from this list. And you might be out there thinking, Josh, what are you talking about a song from Dumbo for? Well, let's talk about You'll Be in My Heart, which is overheated and underdone Baby Mine, both orally and I'd say visually. My additional hot take, I would genuinely like this song more if Glenn Close sang all of it, because within the context of the film, Kala, when Tarzan the baby starts crying like a baby does, she tries to calm him down. She sings the first verse of You'll Be in My Heart. And even if that wasn't enough proof, we know that Glenn Close can perform on Broadway, no matter what Patti LuPone might say. That's a month-old reference that hopefully some of you will still appreciate. My point being, she understands the assignment. She's singing it well. It's got a nice, tender, querulous tone to it. It's not meant to be super polished. And I don't mean that to say that Glenn Close doesn't have a fine voice. She does. It makes sense for that context. And then suddenly Phil Collins butts in. And it's like, maybe if the actress you cast wasn't an Academy Award nominated actress by this point, lots of people knew who Glenn Close was. People who knew Disney movies would have known her for having played Cruella de Vil in the 101 Dalmatians remake. It's so weird that they transition it from her to him. Because I know there's the end credits version that Phil Collins sings, and that has a bit of a different tone to it. As I understand it, that song may have been a little bit inspired by him trying to communicate to his kids about how, sorry that dad's off gallivanting the world touring and not spending time with you, something along those lines. But the point is, the song is okay, and I think it suffers for not being entirely performed by Glenn Close. And more to the point, as I said, it's been done before in one of the most iconic Disney songs of all time. I appreciate them trying to top it, but it doesn't work, in my opinion. What do the two of you think?
Okay. So yeah, that was my immediate response. Is just sort of like, why not just let her sing the whole thing? Because look, I'm totally up for the argument that Tarzan singing is weird. I think it's a lack of imagination, whatever. But like, why can't she sing what is a lullaby effectively, right? Like, just let her sing it. Like, let her sing the whole song. Let that play out. Like, it does not need, and it's not even the full version of the song. Right? Like, obviously there's the full radio edit, which has the whole thing going on and going through that, but like, they're not playing all these verses. Not like it's a huge extended sequence. Like, just let her finish it. And like, it really does raise a lot of questions about why that decision was made. Why let her start singing it at all? Right? If that was the vibe they were sort of thinking about her going for. And it just, again, it kind of feels that like hesitancy. There's this idea, we can't let her sing the whole thing. And it just feels craven. Like, it just does not seem like they have confidence in the kind of movie they're trying to make. And I think that that's where you start to look at a song like that and just sort of realize, look, as like a basic, ballad and the experience, it's fine. I don't think the idea of it being number 3, I agree, is absurd, but like, the idea of like the hesitancy with which they kind of present it in the film, the kind of like split focus, it just seems like a creative decision I don't have a good explanation for. Like, I can't find, like, let it be diegetic. Let it be what it is, given that you acknowledge that. And it just seems like, I don't know, it is the question mark at the core of this. I can understand the larger decision more than I can understand the macro better than the micro in this.
Yeah, I mean, it is so weird given what we've already been talking about in terms of the decision not to let characters sing. That almost like, they were midway through the first verse and someone went, oh, damn, that wasn't what we were going to do. Oh, Phil, get in here. And they suddenly had this abrupt change of heart. And again, as we will talk about with some of the cover versions later, this is an example of the worst possible version of this song. I don't think the song is bad. This version of the song in this context is bad. It's not, and I think that there are versions of it that show what it can and should have been. And I think that it's interesting for me, as I've said in many cases, where certain songs only work within the context of the scene in which they appear. This is one that just works the least in the context of the scene in which it appears.
I agree. And again, we'll talk about the films showing at the Academy Awards relative to this song soon enough, because the Ringer might annoy me, although I should note the guy who wrote the bit about this song, he's a baseball writer whose work I enjoy. So I shouldn't give him too much grief, but also it's not as bad as the Oscar, which we'll talk about here shortly. But before we can do that, we should talk about the third song. So once Tarzan starts to get into the swing of things as a member of Kala and Kerchak's clan, he still has to prove himself, because Kerchak sees him as human, does not believe that he will ever have truly good intentions, but only after Tarzan is able to kill, it was a leopard, by the way, not a cheetah, the leopard who killed not only his parents, but also Kala's son many years ago. Kerchak finally respects him, and as that occurs, before we ever meet grown-up Tarzan or Jane, really, this song climaxes with us really getting to meet Tarzan, and that would be Son of Man, another montage song. I will say I like this one more than Two Worlds, less because of the lyrics. One of them is actually, I'll get to it in a second. I like the beat of this song. This is truly a song that represents the ideals of the episode of a good drummer. this is a good drummer kind of song. This has a good beat. This is one where at least the music of it, I think, yes, this sounds like something that would have appealed to Phil Collins. We will talk about the grim underbelly of Phil Collins and percussion very, very shortly, but not with this song. I like this in spite of lyrics like, in learning, you will teach, and in teaching, you will learn, which made me think of another film from 1999, my dear beloved cult favorite, Mystery Men. If you know that movie and you remember Wes Studi's character, the Sphinx, then you know how much a line like that would have fit coming out of his character's mouth in that film. If you haven't seen Mystery Men, you should. It's weirdly it was ahead of its time regarding superheroes, I would say. What do the two of you think of Son of Man, though?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm on the same boat. If you actually pick a song from the soundtrack where I would argue that Phil Collins went harder than he needed to, this would be the one I would choose. And I think it's because, like you say, it's the percussion element of it, and it's because, like, from a musical perspective, it's very propulsive. And I think it's not a coincidence. It's linked to the surfing, right? The sort of like the iconic shift of just like, what if Tarzan surfs through the trees? And then obviously benefiting from the CGI backgrounds and animation, being able to sell the kind of like moving through physical space in the midst of it, which is very impressive to watch back, to think about like where that was heading and working from. I think it's a very sort of like effective sort of like driving piece. And if you were to just ask me to like, well, I'm going to pick up the Tarzan soundtrack and pick a song, this is one I would pick. And I don't think it's in context. It's just a montage song. It's just Hakuna Matataing Tarzan. Like, it's just like, that's what it's doing, and that's fine, right? Like, totally normal. That's how we use songs in the context of musicals, which again, one rare case where it does feel very musically oriented. But it is also lyrically incredibly stupid. But that's neither here nor there.
It is, in fact, here and there. I mean, I think, I actually would say if this song had come first, I might have had the exact inverse reaction. It's like, oh, this is the one that I like most because it was the one that has that kind of energy to it, and I, could really groove to it. But again, by this point, I'm getting like, here's another one of those songs. But yeah, the lyrics are terrible. And you singled out when you said, oh, the terrible lyric, you're like that one. It's like, oh yeah, but also the wisdom to be wise. The wisdom to be wise. I mean, the tautology to be tautological. Yeah, that, all of that stuff. There, in this journey you're making, there will be answers that you'll seek. And it's like, just, yeah, he may have gone hard in certain ways. That was not one of them. He did not go hard lyrically.
I will say, when I simply read lyrics like, I want to get it right, on this journey that you're making, there'll be answers that you'll seek. It's you who will climb the mountain. It's you who will reach the peak. Do you know what I think of? Am I reading to my son, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss? Like, it's a very, like, it feels like he's trying to be clever in that way, but it's like, I don't know, buddy. Again, I like Phil Collins' music. I can't say that the lyrics are always the things that really stand out. Because, by the way, Scott, talking about other great lyrics, all the things you dreamed of, the visions that you saw, well, yeah, I suppose if I have visions, I would see them. That does seem like something you'd want. By the way, before I forget, I do just want to mention something. I realized as we were talking, I mentioned we've talked about how Kevin Lima is one of this film's co-directors. I think it's really funny to consider that the movie he made after this was not Enchanted, but 102 Dalmatians, starring Glenn Close. And the film before this that he directed also has a very passionate fan base when it comes to its music, and that would be a Goofy movie. So I will also say, if we want to do the I Can't Believe This Song Went Hard, Eye to Eye is right there. A much better song than anything in this movie, I will say. But anyway, so I like the music of Son of Man. The lyrics are, again, not great. And I would also point out that the montage style of songs like that, or of Two Worlds, kind of emphasizes how you don't need them, or you don't need them to be that long. Because again, this movie, if you stop it right when the end credits begin, this is an 82-minute movie. It takes about a half hour to get to grown-up Tarzan, which it may be one of the reasons why Kevin Lima had said, I don't want to have Tarzan sing, because you're only going to get grown-up Tarzan for the back half, similar to how you have Matthew Broderick as grown-up Simba in the 94 Lion King. it takes 32 minutes to beat Jane. Myles, being my editor, knows how passionately I am about looking at time codes for things. And anybody who reads my Poker Face reviews knows exactly what I'm talking about, for good or ill. But anyway, once Jane shows up, she shows up with her father. Jane here is voiced by Minnie Driver. Her father is voiced by Nigel Hawthorne. They are joined by a very clearly, obviously evil poacher named Clayton, or in the parlance of You Talking You Two to Me, Clay 2,000 pounds. And he is, again, he's like a combination of, forget the character's name, the bad guy from Pocahontas that David Ogden Stiers plays, or the poacher McLeach from Rescuers Down Under. He seems like kind of a combo of that, voiced by Brian Blessed. And soon after that, they make camp, the idea being that Jane and her father are trying to explore the unique gorilla pods of the jungles. Of course, Clayton and his men want very badly to kill as many animals as they can to make lots of money poaching them. And all the while, they're trying to find these animals. Tarzan's good friends, Turk, voiced by Rosie O'Donnell, Tantor, voiced by Wayne Knight, and others, decide to explore the camp in a song fittingly called Trashin' the Camp. And I do say trashin' with an apostrophe, folks. There's no G at the end of this. That's how playful this song is. And listen, is this the worst Disney song of all time? No, it is not. I probably would pick something from the Aristocats. If I was ranking the 40 worst Disney songs, though, this might not be much lower than number 3. I hate this song. I hate this song. I have hated this song since it was in theaters. And part of the reason why is, it has no purpose. It has no use. It is meant, you mentioned, Myles, before, there's a little bit of like a Hakuna Matata-esque angle to one of the earlier songs. This feels like the only one that's trying to be a little comic reliefy. Again, you get Rosie O'Donnell, who was, let's remind ourselves, in 1999, pretty much at the peak of her TV fame because of her talk show, which, if people don't realize, she had a talk show before she was on The View. I promise, it's real. She was a big fan of Tom Cruise for a while. That was a whole thing.
Koosh Balls. Remember Koosh Balls?
I do. Put it this way, for anybody listening who doesn't know, think of what would the Ellen DeGeneres show have been in the 1990s. The answer would have been the Rosie O'Donnell show. And she is an obvious choice for a comic relief character based on things like that in film roles in movies like Sleepless in Seattle and A League of Their Own. Wayne Knight, of course, big part of Seinfeld and Third Rock from the Sun. And then all you give them is this weird, scatting faux lyrics. I can't tell, by the way, who I should feel worse for. Rosie O'Donnell and Wayne Knight for getting saddled with this song, or In Sync for the cover version that they do with Phil Collins in the end credits or on the soundtrack. Because again, talking about people at the height of their fame, as a band, In Sync was pretty damn popular in the late 90s. So it makes sense that Disney would say, come on in, guys, we're going to have you sing a song in a Disney movie. Is it the big love ballad? No, it's the song where animals destroy a camp. So here's the lyrics that you get to read, guys. Have fun. Yeah, I hate this song. What are the two you think?
Okay, so what it reminds me of is the Mr. Music song Jake Gyllenhaal does in And obviously it is far inferior to that song. But
yes,
it reminds me of it because it is just literally the idea of just like, it's music making, right? And it takes this notion of just like that music comes from things that aren't instruments, which again is the premise of that song. But it kind of uses that to be like, oh, well, let's create this sort of like musical moment. But again, it feels so worried about it being a musical where it's like, oh, well, this is just going to be kind of like a little musical moment, not a song. Calling it a song, I think, is frankly overstating things. Because particularly, and I know it's on the soundtrack, I know there's an inexplicable NSYNC version like you say, but in the moment of the movie, it really just kind of seems like they're like discovering music in this diegetic way, and it kind of like coming to life amidst that. But you're right that like, I can't tell you what this adds other than just sort of being like, I'm imagining him playing this for Lily Collins and her like laughing because it's stupid. And just deciding to put it in the movie. Like, that's what it feels like. It feels very much like this, like you say, kind of very much trifling. And then it just kind of feels like, okay, but what did we accomplish from that? Did it tell us something new about a character? Did it advance the plot? It literally just feels, and that's the thing, like, I know that like reading the Wikipedia page, like so many of these films, it had like a comedy pass towards the end where they were trying to like inject more comedy in it. And it like made me wonder, like, was this song a note? Like, was this kind of like, was it an idea of just like, hey, like, some of the other stuff is pretty heavy. We want to have one song that's more lighthearted. And this was maybe absent of a plot or a script or whatever was happening, just the instinct that they went with. But yeah, it is confusing. And I think that that's kind of where I land on it, even though I could pretty much like tell you all the shoot bobs in my head too anyway.
I think we've already talked somewhat about the ways in which this was sort of diverging from the formula, from what had really been an established formula for the Disney Renaissance films, and the things that Ashman and Menken sort of figured out, that the musical structure, like when you had your I Want song, blah blah blah, and this didn't really do that. But this did feel like we need a showstopper. And none of and the Phil Collins songs didn't really serve that purpose. So this is sort of this vague attempt at the showstopper where you could have something that would be like hey, this is da 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 da, boom, and we're gonna have our, reference to the Silly Symphony skeleton dance, and we're gonna, do all this nonsense, and it's just it feels like it's kind of like what we're talking about already with You'll Be in My Heart, which is a half measure, not really just, are you going to use that formula, or are you not going to do it? If you're not going to do it, don't do it. Don't try this version, this half-hearted version of a production number, the showstopper that doesn't really actually have a song attached to it that anyone's going to remember.
It's true. We've been having a mostly episode of good drummers, but this is a mini episode of bad drummers, is my opinion. But anyway, so after that absolutely hideous song, as Tarzan is getting closer to Jane, he is realizing, oh, this creature is like me. This is somebody who is he can't put the words to it, but he can understand, of course, that Jane and her dad and Clayton are humans, whereas he obviously is not. And he is, of course, beginning to kind of ask questions. He learns from Kala that she adopted him and that there are other humans out there. And as this is going on, as they're growing closer together, we get one more song, and that, of course, would be Strangers Like Me, which, on the one hand, I will argue, unfortunately for myself, that song's music is pretty catchy. I found myself humming it a few days after I saw the film again without having re-listened to the song separately. The chorus, the music of it works. I think, again, as much as Phil Collins is a very talented musician, lyrics, maybe not a strong suit, with lyrics like, show me everything and tell me how. It all means something and yet nothing to me. It's all so close and yet so far. Oh boy. Hate to be in in a place like that. You're between a rock and a hard place. Again, it's fine. It's a case where it's funny, Myles, you were noting before with Son of Man, the blending of hand-drawn and CG with those fast-paced shots, watching Tarzan surf through the trees. Moments like that, the music kind of enhances a little bit, but the animation itself is a lot more enjoyable to watch than it is to hear Phil Collins' mildly reedy singing voice accompany it. I can speak, I promise. The point being, this one's okay. I still think of the three montage songs, Son of Man is strongest. This might be second in my book, just for the catchiness of the tune. What do the two of you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think perhaps if I'm picking a musical moment, it's like the Strangers Like Me bridge into the key change that follows, A+. I'm going to hold on to that one in terms of selling that. But yeah, I think it's like one of those cases where I think to Scott's point about diminishing returns, it is just the same kind of song attached to the same kind of montage 3 separate times in this movie. And I think that like it just at a certain point you start to realize, okay, if what differentiates these songs is their lyrics. And if the worst part of these songs is their lyrics, right? Like you kind of end up in a place of just like starting to play this game where it's just like, if you go based on vibes, you can say, okay, well, he's matching this moment. I think they more or less work okay as sort of like musical backdrops to what's being accomplished here. But I also think that there's just not enough distinction between them for it to like accumulate the way a good musical does, right? A
Mm.
musical is supposed to have a musical narrative through line where the music is building in the same way as the story is. And we're seeing the development over time and like listening to like, I just saw the live action How to Train Your Dragon, and like just listening to John Powell's almost identical score, which I don't have time for that, but like just realizing the way that score builds over time, the way the themes like evolve and all play up, and the way that all comes out in the film's conclusion, where you see all those themes playing out and motifs, and you realize that like what Phil Collins is doing has none of that nuance. Like, it does not feel like it's really gaining that musical evolution that I think you would want it to, which is therefore leaving the film. I think Encino's work with film is good. It just doesn't feel like it has the same narrative through line, because the songs come in and hit the same note. A note that I think I like better, right, than some of you, but that nonetheless is still very samey. I can't argue against that.
You know, I would love to play a game whereby you take, let's say, the lyrics to any given verse of Two Worlds and put them into the verse of this, and would anyone recognize the difference? You know, you'd notice because if you did it with the chorus, because the title wouldn't be there. But it's like, if you were just listening to this and you're like, hey, it's, you know, the meter's exactly the same. And it's like, it's all, and I mean, and that's really the problem with these, is it's just, there's nothing about any of these lyrics that tells a story. They're the most banal platitudes possible in, you know, in every context. And so it doesn't do anything. And again, to Myles' point, it's like they don't create any kind of emotion on their own. It's just, it's another song, which another montage. And I like the montage itself. I mean, I kind of like most of these, but I also wonder about the choice to use the Disney smitten face. I don't know that's not talked about enough in the tropes of Disney animation. You know, it's the face that Mowgli makes when the girl appears by the river. It's that little one raised nostril look. You know, it's that thing.
DreamWorks has the raised eyebrow. Yeah. Disney has the smitten face. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I should also note, one of the things about the songs of this movie that I think make them stand out in a not great way. We've talked before about how this isn't really a standard musical, but it obviously isn't just a straight up movie sans songs. But after Strangers Like Me, there's no songs until we get to the very end of the film with a very brief reprise of Two Worlds. Because there's a lot of action involved. Clayton reveals his obviously evil nature. Tarzan and Clayton have a big fight. Kerchak gets involved and is killed. It ends with Jane and her dad deciding to stay on the island with Tarzan. They'll become closer to be like him. It's not that kind of maybe more traditional version of Tarzan, a la George of the Jungle, where Tarzan actually goes back to the mainland and there's no fish out of water stuff. Like that. There's a little bit of it in Tarzan and Jane's initial interactions. And I will say, songs aside, I'd forgotten the funny and weird running gag briefly where Tony Goldwyn is impersonating Minnie Driver because of how unfamiliar human speech is to him. And it's really, really funny. and again, intentionally so. And Minnie Driver is, I think, really well cast in the film. It does not surprise me that she was nominated for her work at the Annie Awards, but there's little bits and pieces about this where it's like, yeah, this is fine. This is okay. I just don't really know that song-wise there's a whole lot to grip onto. Now, I do want to talk about the covers, but before that, I do want to talk briefly about this movie's awards showing. And I actually want to acknowledge it did get a baffling amount of attention across a lot of different awards-giving bodies. I do think it's funny, by the way, that the 2000 Kids' Choice Awards, for example, Rosie O'Donnell hosted, and wouldn't you know it, she got the award for favorite voice from an animated movie. But this movie, only one song got nominated. It was, it was favorite song from a movie. It was not You'll Be in My Heart. It was Two Worlds. And first, I would like, Scott, you'll appreciate this. One of the other nominees in that category, Music of My Heart from Music of the Heart. Diane Warren strikes out again. I'd forgotten, by the way, speaking of a group we've already talked about, I didn't realize that NSYNC co-performed on that song with Gloria Estefan, but they did. The other losing title there was Beautiful Stranger by Madonna from Austin Powers and Spy Who Shagged Me. Would either of you like to guess what song won a favorite song from a movie that year? It's not a Disney song.
In the Kids' Choice Awards?
Yes.
Oh, good grief. And it's not one of the ones that we've already mentioned because of our previous show on the 99.
No, it is not. Here, I'll give you two hints. It is from a summer 1999 movie, and the title of the song is the title of the movie.
No.
All right.
Nope.
Myles, any guesses?
No, I got nothing.
Why, of course, I'm talking about Wild Wild West by Will Smith.
Yeah.
I should have said it. He's the guy in the film with him was in Hunchback because Kevin Kline.
Yeah, that might have got me there.
There you go. You'll Be at My Heart was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Song written for visual media in the year 2000 because of the weird timing of how the Grammys released their awards. Among the other losing nominees, Music of My Heart. The winner was Beautiful Stranger. And no need to worry about Randy Newman When She Loved Me because he won the Grammy for that song the following year. The Golden Globes gave it to You'll Be in My Heart. I don't know why, but also the Golden Globes are not exactly a Tony Awards giving body, no matter what they might act like. And then, of course, we get to the Academy Awards of 1999. Now, I did things interesting, by the way. We didn't mention as much in our discussion of the Toy Story songs. Tarzan's score did not get nominated in 1999, weirdly enough. The nominees were The Talented Mr. Ripley, The Cider House Rules, Angela's Ashes, American Beauty, and the winner, The Red Violin. But, as we have already discussed, Scott and I, You'll Be at My Heart not only was nominated for Best Song, but it won Best Song. And on the one hand, as we kind of talked about in that discussion, there might have been a little bit of pull of, we can give an Academy Award to a big musician. Phil Collins, a very popular musician by the end of the 1990s, similar to how they gave an Oscar to Elton John in 94, or, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice for the original song in Evita a couple of years later. I think to me, the flip side is they could have really been on the cutting edge of pop culture by saying, let's give it to the South Park guys. Wasn't this the same year that they came to the Oscars dressed like the J-Lo dress, right? Is that same year?
Yes.
Wow. Yes. And I want to be very clear. It is far and away the least interesting winner of this category. So it's like you have Magnolia and Amy Mann.
Yep.
The idea of Amy Mann as an Oscar winner is just inherently interesting. You have South Park. Obviously, you have Robin Williams performing that song on the show. Like, it would have been such a sort of coronation of that. You have When She Loved Me, the actual best song in the category. And the most effective in the context of its film, which I'm sure you talked about and going through.
Oh, yes.
And then you might think, but Music of My Heart, that would be a deeply boring winner. But then we would have been saved from how many deeply boring Diane Warren songs being subsequently nominated because they've never given her an actual Oscar in a competitive context. And she keeps writing these terrible songs that nobody remembers and getting nominated for. We could have been saved by that. And instead, we get an Oscar for a perfectly fine song that is certainly and look, it was a big radio hit too, right? Like, we're not even just talking about what was a movie song.
Right.
Like, this was a legitimate adult contemporary hit. And I do think that makes a difference, and it does somewhat distinguish it. And it goes back to the Lion King songs, right? Which, like, Elton John's versions of those songs were just as big a hit as the movie itself. Colors of the Wind, similarly.
Well, like My Heart Will Go On a couple of years before that.
Right.
Before
like,
this,
we are sort of at a stage, and like, this is very much the end of that process for Disney, right? Where realistically, like, their ability to use their animated films as legitimate pop songs just really didn't happen after this. And so I do think that it kind of like reinforces, like you already saw with Reflection missing the year before, not getting a nomination, right? That there was some clear sort of tension in the way Disney's like coronation as this major Oscar player were starting to shift. But I do think that this was sort of like, oh, we got Phil Collins back, we got a star again, we got a radio hit, let's pull it out there. And I do think that as a result, it ends up feeling more as about that than about the actual song. The Oscars not being about the actual song, but instead being like distracted by shiny things, who knew?
Listen, they did get it right a few years ago. I was reminding myself that they gave the only Oscar they gave to RRR was for the song Not To, Not To, which is a great musical sequence. And sadly, one of, I think it was 8 straight years of the last 8 years in which Diane Warren wrote a song, got nominated, didn't win. I will say, I'm going to challenge something you said, Myles. You don't wake up every morning humming The Fire Inside from Flamin' Hot?
True, I don't. It's a failure of my life. It's a failure of imagination that
This is now forever going to be my example for people who decide to be Oscar nomination completists. It's like whatever the version of the Cheeto movie is for this year is it's the thing. It's like, really, you're going to do that just to get the Diane Warren song?
Yeah, I know. It is wild. I mean, and they could have, the funny thing is I'm just looking to see that same year, the year she got nominated for Flamin' Hot was the year the Oscars gave the wrong Barbie song the Oscar, because they should have given it to I'm Just Ken, but they didn't. Anyway, so Oscars aside, there are, as we have alluded to, there are lots of covers. Now, it's funny that Scott was mentioning them earlier, because earlier today, before we recorded, Scott and I were sharing emails. And I know, Scott, you do such remarkable research about these covers. And I mean that sincerely. And a reason why I bring it up is you shared a couple with me. And one of the ones you shared with me was a cover by a guy named Peyton Parrish, who, for all I know, is a perfectly wonderful human being. But you'd mentioned that, and I thought, yeah, I heard that one. That was the one that made me stop wanting to listen to the covers, because all the covers I heard, to a comment you made earlier, sounded the exact same. They all sounded like guys who were trying to make these very low-key, arguably kind of placid songs into these intense hard rockers. Get that kind of like, Creed style, Scott Stapp kind of voice, like some kind of outlandish, speaking of bombast into it that does not need to be there. I will admit, none of those covers I heard. There was one by Tammy Tuckey, who is a Disney theme park performer who people might know. She did a version of Strangers Like Me that I thought was like, yeah, that's good. I liked that. But for the most part, I like these covers made me want to stop listening to these covers. I'll put it that way. Did you hear any others that you'd want to call out?
Well, I drew your attention to one by a sister pop band called Everlife that did Strangers Like Me. And I thought that had a kind of a neat, different kind of energy to it that I appreciate. And I think that's, what you're looking for is there a reason for this thing to exist other than I wanted to sing it? And that was, at least to me, giving something a little bit different. What I discovered in the course of listening to way too many You'll Be in My Heart covers is exactly, now we don't need to talk again about Michael Crawford. We've talked enough about Michael Crawford's Disney covers. Let us never speak of him again. He does a version of You'll Be in My Heart. It's awful. Move on. But the versions of them that basically make the same mistake that the Phil Collins version of overproducing it. There's a version by Usher on one of the, Disney pop compilations. There's a version by the country artist Bucky Covington that does that. And, those things, it's like, and then there are versions which I think make the right decision, which is to take it down. And, Kenny Loggins, who did a number of covers on his Pooh Corner records, does a version of this, of You'll Be in My Heart, which again, it feels like a lullaby. That's the way it should feel. Whatever you feel about Kenny Loggins, this version, I think, kind of is in the spirit of what that song is. It sounds like a lullaby. And there's also an instrumental version by the jazz guitarist George Benson, which kind of gets the same thing. And I think that it's just a reminder to me of, you can interpret something, and I'm not saying that there are wrong interpretations, but there are interpretations that I think just sort of miss the point. And it's a shame that one of them was the person who wrote it seemed to miss the point of the song. But a lot of the covers, I think, actually were able to get that idea of it being a much more contemplative, gentle song and not have to have, a lot of production.
That is a fair point. Myles, did you happen to sniff out any covers? It's okay if you did, but we always like to have a little bit of discussion near the end about those.
No, I will say it's like, I think it makes sense. Like, I think for me, when I think about, like, again, a cover of this song, one thing I did think was interesting, of course, is like the movie version and the pop version of this song are very different. And obviously one of them leans more in that direction than the other. And I'm always curious, like, what, like, the drive from, like, what their motivations are, but I'm just like looking at quickly at Spotify at the different examples, like just from the length of them, right? Like some of them are like 2:30, 1:30, drawing more from the film version. And there's others where it's like, this does not need to be a 4-minute and 16-second song. Like, it's not, that would never be my instinct of how to approach that. But I will say that I do see there seems to be a version by Celtic Woman listed on Spotify, about which I have questions.
Well, and here's the thing. Now, I have questions about one thing that we've briefly alluded to. I mentioned earlier that, just as I love referencing You Talking You Two to Me, where they did an entire episode about the Broadway show those guys wrote, the Spider-Man webhead, please turn in this direction and turn off the dark. Phil Collins wrote 9 new songs for the stage version of Tarzan. Again, speaking of a show that I presume had to have a little bit of trickery in terms of how the title character moves around his settings. I will say the fact that I'm going to list for you in order up to a point the songs in the first act of the show. Two Worlds. Okay. You'll Be in My Heart. Obviously. Jungle Funk. Oh boy. That's the third song in Tarzan Act 1. And I just think, well, that doesn't sound encouraging. There's other songs here that sound very much like lyrics from this film. I Need to Know. Waiting for This Moment. Sure as Sun Turns to Moon. Everything That I Am. It's like, are these actual lyrics from the songs that he just pulled out and expanded into other ones? I have not heard the original Broadway cast recording. I don't know if either of you have ever seen a version of it on stage. It just seems like it would be, even more than Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, exceedingly challenging to put this kind of story onto on stage. And I mean, I don't think it only lasted for about a year plus. It lasted for 35 previews and 486 performances on Broadway, which is not great, Bob. It's fascinating to me. And also, speaking of American Idols, because Bucky Covington, wasn't he on American Idol? Isn't that why I know that name? Wasn't he a contestant way back when?
That sounds right, but I don't know for sure.
The reason why I mention is the guy who originated the role of Tarzan on Broadway was Josh Strickland, who was in season 2 of American Idol. I recognize that name. They drew from a very clear pool.
And speaking of American Idol, I think that William Hung actually does a cover version of Son of Man.
Okay.
Sure he does.
I'm sorry. Do you mean the star of Hung Jury with Jay Reinhold? Speaking of Arrested Development references. Sorry, go ahead, Myles.
Well, no, I think it's interesting, sort of like going through, like, and again, at a certain point, this does become reading Wikipedia pages because I never got a chance to see a show. It does seem like it was a case where they thought, wouldn't it be cool if Tarzan flew over the audience? Like, similar to the Spider-Man thing, for that matter, right? It was just like, well, wouldn't that be cool? And not thinking about the logic of taking a film they actively avoided turning into a musical and turning it into a musical. So there's a review here of the cast recording. Collins seems to understand that theater lyrics, this from All Music, seems to understand that theater lyrics, perhaps even more than pop song lyrics, need to be concise to get dramatic points across quickly and clearly. What he doesn't seem to realize is they doesn't mean they should be little more than a string of platitudes, cliches, and contemporary slang. It's a shame his words are as bad as his music is good. And I do think that, like, you start to sort of realize that tension about, like, where that exists and how that plays out. So the fact that it made it to Broadway, I think, says a lot about that period of time and Shoemaker's attempt to sort of make Disney on Broadway a thing, and them sort of realizing the limitations of that and the limits of that in terms of how to approach that question. And so even if we could say that, like, Tarzan, because it's not really a musical, didn't kill the Disney musical, right? It already demonstrates that internally in Disney, they were resisting and fighting back and pushing, and Emperor's New Groove comes shortly afterwards to demonstrate that in clear view. But then subsequent to that, you also think about, like, but did Tarzan kill the Broadway Disney musical in terms of this sort of, like, pipeline, which then took a long time after that?
It took a lot till Frozen, really. Disney basically.
I mean, yes, kind of, but I will note, I'm looking right now, and Myles might have noticed this too. Little Mermaid came out on Broadway 2 years after Tarzan. Aladdin was in 2011, both of which were certainly more successful, I think, than the Tarzan show
Aladdin
would have ended up being.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think it's sort of, I think for a while they thought they could do this with all of their movies.
Right.
Right? Like they thought that like, oh, we can make it out of anything. We've got these huge hits. And then I think it's not shocking to me they went to Mermaid and Aladdin, going right back to the core of the Renaissance, as if to be like, okay, no, we can't just do this with anything. We need to stick with the hits. We need to stick with the most kind of nostalgic pieces of that.
Yes, for sure. I think it's, to your point, I think what's fascinating is they said, okay, we've had big successes with The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast on Broadway. What's next? Should it be something like The Little Mermaid or Aladdin? No, let's have Hunchback, which I like Hunchback of Notre Dame as a film, not as big of a success within the Renaissance era. Tarzan was a bigger one, to be clear. It was the 6th highest grossing film at the box office in 1989. Obviously, films like Star Wars Episode 1 of The Phantom Menace and Toy Story 2, much bigger hits. But it's just weird to me that they didn't say Aladdin, Little Mermaid, massive films. We should turn those in the same way that it surprises me that it apparently took Disney until 2021 to make a musical version of Winnie the Pooh on stage, which I only mention here because apparently there was a time when Disney wanted to have a book written by Edward Albee. And if you don't know who Edward Albee is, please Google him and then you will understand why we are all laughing about that. Anyway.
Well, David Henry,
yeah, go ahead, Scott.
David Henry Wang wrote the book for Tarzan.
He did. That is true. And I mean, he's done a couple of Disney titles, I think. Well, he had worked on Aida, which is a Disney theatrical production, even though it was not previously a Disney animated film. And I'm trying to forget, I know obviously he did M. Butterfly, which again, kids, Google. You should Google that. Didn't he work on the remake of Mulan? Am I crazy? I might be crazy about this one. I thought he did some
I
other
don't recall
Disney
that,
thing.
but
No, I might be making that one up. I'm looking that up right now, and I may have, for some reason I thought he had been involved in some capacity in another Disney project. But yes, he's a big name to get for Tarzan.
But he did write a libretto with Howard Shore writing the music for an opera version of David Cronenberg's The Fly. Wow.
Oh boy.
The more you know.
I mean, I feel like it had to have been Phil Collins, right? A lot of this just comes back to Phil Collins, right? As to like why any number of decisions were made. It was this idea that it's like, well, we're in the Phil Collins business. We have the ability to use Phil Collins and his sort of stardom to launch this musical and to kind of like get that out there. That was kind of like, another sort of like dimension of this in terms of playing it out. And like maybe with things like Aladdin and Little Mermaid that Menken didn't want to get too involved, who knows, right? Like what relationships were at given points in time. But it does strike me as an insane choice, given everything we know about it and given how it played out. I will say, though, just reading over this, apparently big hit in Germany.
Yes. Well, and I can tell you that was also true of the Hunchback of Notre Dame stage production. Yeah. Weirdly popular in Europe. And I by the way, I just realized I know why I had David Henry Hwang and Disney on the brain. He was going to be involved in the remake that they were talking about doing of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the film version, that I think has since been scuttled because of lots of different reasons. But I think that's where I had seen his name not too long ago relative to Disney. Anything else folks would like to bring up here before we pull the vines down on this episode of Mousterpiece Melodies?
Not today.
By the way, I very much appreciated your extremely heavy sigh at my William Hunt reference, Scott. I'm going to amplify the volume on that one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, I guess if I had a final note, I would just sort of
Please.
say that, like, I think the way it sits at the end of the Renaissance, to your point, where it's kind of like it is in the Renaissance. I don't think there's any reasonable argument to be made that this film does not belong to that same trajectory and tradition.
Sure.
And like reading the production notes and hearing like the movies they all came from, and like they were coming off of Pocahontas and Goofy Movie and all these things and kind of building from there. But like one of the things that stood out from that conversation to me, from like the Wikipedia summary, was the idea that Katzenberg wanted the TV division to make this. And then it was only after he was fired that they agreed to make it theatrically. And there was this idea then that like they didn't think in the very limited parlance of what they thought the Renaissance was and the kind of movie that could be a big Disney movie, that ultimately it wasn't fitting that mold of the musical, right? Of that kind of project, that it was going to become this sort of test case for something else. And I wonder, kind of going back, like, did they ever fully resolve that tension of what the movie was and what they wanted it to be and how that played out? And it does sort of feel like that kind of like learning curve of what music meant to a Disney film over this period of time. And I feel like, you know, if this film never had that tension because of that decision early on to just say, he's not going to sing, that's it. If you then like contrast that with what we know from The Sweatbox and Emperor's New Groove and Kingdom of the Sun, where that was like literally playing out and destroying the fabric of that film, to end up with something I love dearly, but like to really kind of like go through all of that this film avoided that, but it was happening at the same time, right? Like that it might not have gotten the shrapnel, but it kind of still bears the marks of a sort of very tenuous period in the relationship between this company and the very idea of music for reasons that we can kind of parse over and deal with.
Yeah. All good points. And obviously our opinions about the songs of this film are so uniform that nobody will disagree with us. So I'm looking forward to the reaction from listeners. Scott, why don't you take us out?
So with that, it's time to turn down the volume on Mousterpiece Melodies. What's on the playlist for our next episode? From 2024, Mufasa, the Lion King. And while you wait, make sure you subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. Myles McNutt, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we mentioned your credits at the top of the show, but as a reminder, can you please let listeners know where they can find you on the internet?
You can find me on Blue Sky at MEMLES. It's technically pronounced Mimos. I don't care how people say it. And then you can also find me, as Josh mentioned, at Episodic Medium, my newsletter where I review TV and talk about things with great contributors like Josh and others.
Of course, we'd love for all of you to listen along with us. Tell us what you think. By the way, I like how I gave the heavy sigh when Scott mentioned Mufasa the Lion King, and I thought, dummy, you're the one who put that one on the calendar first. It's not Scott's fault. It's mine. By the way, Scott, I'm just going to put it out here right now. I don't know that we're going to have a guest for that one because I don't know how many people want to dive on that grenade. That's okay.
We'll find out.
Yeah, we will. Anyway, we'd love for all of you out there to listen along with us. Tell us what you think. Do you love the songs of Tarzan? Maybe you do. Do you hate them? Even, again, my grouchiness aside, even I don't hate these songs. But if you have any comments, questions, or opinions you'd like to share, you can always reach me at masterpiececinema@gmail.com. Follow me on Blue Sky at Mousterpiece. As Myles alluded, I am a contributor at Episodic Medium, and we are knee deep in the back half of Poker Face Season 2. I have been reviewing that each week. It is a very, very interesting season. Lots of good guest stars. Lots of excuses for me to make references to I Think You Should Leave with Tim Robinson, including in an upcoming episode. Spoiler alert. So anyway, follow me there. Keep an eye out. I'll post links to that on Blue Sky. Scott, where can our listeners find you online?
Well, I'm on Blue Sky at Scott Renshaw. You can also find me on Letterboxd at Scott Renshaw, and my primary outlet is Salt Lake City Weekly and at cityweekly.net. This week, I'm going to be taking on the 20th anniversary of Brokeback Mountain, among the other new releases that will be coming out for this week, which will include Pixar's Elio. So that's another, unfortunately, not another musical that we can have to talk about going forward. I'm Scott Renshaw.
And I'm Josh Spiegel, and we'll see you all next time on Mousterpiece Melodies.